Welcome. This talk is the first of a series called Fundamentals of Sri Aurobindo's Philosophy in Savitri. The title of this talk is The Brahman, the Absolute, the Omnipresent Reality, the Divine. Savitri is a treasure chest full of wisdom and beauty. According to Mona Sarkar, with whom the mother discussed Savitri at length, the mother told him that everything is there: mysticism, occultism, philosophy, the history of evolution, the history of man, of the gods, of creation, of nature, how the universe was created, why, for what purpose, what destiny, all is there. Of course, Sri Aurobindo has also written about all these things in his extensive prose writings. We find his philosophy laid out most fully in The Life Divine, but it is also described in a more vivid and impactful, if less logically structured language in Savitri. By bringing together these two different types of expression, we may get a fuller understanding and appreciation of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. This is what I would like to do in this series of presentations, to describe the fundamental principles and aspects of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy more clearly and vividly, using his own words expressed in both his prose writings and in Savitri. In today's talk, I will focus on the principle of the Brahman, a word which is not found in Savitri, but which is translated by Sri Aurobindo in both his prose and poetry by such terms as the Absolute, the Supreme, or Omnipresent Reality, God, and his more generic and frequently used term, the Divine. This concept is also a key to other aspects of his philosophy and to unlocking the mystery of our own existence and our often vexed and difficult lives. We find perhaps the most comprehensive and detailed explanation of this concept in The Life Divine, in a chapter called The Brahman, Purusha, Ishwara, Maya, Prakriti, Shakti. I would like to begin by quoting a long passage from this chapter which starts at the beginning and briefly highlight key points. I'll break it into several shorter segments and comment on each. Afterwards, I will supplement this explanation with two shorter quotes from other prose writings, one from the Synthesis of Yoga and one from Letters on Yoga, that bring out other aspects that round out our understanding. And following these, I will quote several long passages from Savitri and briefly highlight the central ideas that are expressed. So from The Life Divine. There is then a supreme reality, eternal, absolute, and infinite. Because it is absolute and infinite, it is in its essence indeterminable. It is indefinable and inconceivable by finite and defining mind. It is ineffable by a mind-created speech. It is describable neither by our negations, neti, for we cannot limit it by saying it is not this, it is not that, nor by our affirmations, for we cannot fix it by saying it is this, it is that, iti. And yet, though in this way unknowable to us, it is not altogether and in every way unknowable. It is self-evident to itself, and though inexpressible, yet self-evident to a knowledge by identity, of which the spiritual being in us must be capable. For that spiritual being is in its essence and its original and intimate reality not other than this supreme existence. This is from pages 336 to 337. I'll just highlight the main points here. The Brahman is the supreme reality. It is what actually is, the truth of what exists. Sri Aurobindo says that it is eternal, absolute, and infinite. And being infinite and absolute means that it is not limited to any mental idea that we may make of it or any description that we may give to it. However, because it is also the reality of who we are, we can know it by an identification with our own reality. And this spiritual realization is the primary aim of yoga. Sri Aurobindo continues, but although this indeterminable to mind, because of its absoluteness and infinity, we discover that this supreme and eternal infinite determines itself to our consciousness in the universe by real and fundamental truths of its being, which are beyond the universe and in it, and are the very foundation of its existence. These truths present themselves to our conceptual cognition as the fundamental aspects in which we see and experience the omnipresent reality. He is saying that although it is absolute and beyond conception, it presents itself to our mind by certain fundamental truths of its being, through which we can approach and enter into identification with it. He continues, in themselves they are seized directly, not by intellectual understanding, but by a spiritual intuition, a spiritual experience in the very substance of our consciousness. But they can also be caught at in conception by a large and plastic idea, and can be expressed in some sort by a plastic speech, which does not insist too much on rigid definition or limit the wideness and subtlety of the idea. In order to express this experience or this idea with any nearness, a language has to be created which is at once intuitively metaphysical and revealingly poetic, admitting significant and living images as the vehicle of a close, suggestive, and vivid indication. We note here that this large and plastic idea and this plastic speech, which does not insist too much on rigid definition, in a language at once intuitively metaphysical and revealingly poetic, is expressed here in the Life Divine, in the continuation of the same passage as we'll see below, but it is perhaps even better expressed in the poetry of Savitri, which we will see in a few minutes. A few lines down, Sri Aurobindo continues. The supreme truth aspect, which thus manifests to us, is an eternal and infinite and absolute self-existence, self-awareness, self-delight of being. This founds all things and secretly supports and pervades all things. This self-existence reveals itself again in three terms of its essential nature: self, conscious being or spirit, and God, or the divine being. The Indian terms are more satisfactory. Brahman, the reality, is Atman, Purusha, Ishvara. For these terms grew from a root of intuition and, while they have a comprehensive preciseness, are capable of a plastic application, which avoids both vagueness in the use and the rigid snare of a too limiting intellectual concept. The supreme Brahman is that which in Western metaphysics is called the Absolute. But Brahman is at the same time the omnipresent reality in which all that is relative exists as its forms or its movements. This is an absolute which takes all relativities in its embrace. Here, Sri Aurobindo indicates the fundamental truths of the supreme reality which it presents to our mind and through which we can enter into identification with it. These are first, Satchidananda, infinite self-existence, infinite self-awareness, and infinite self-delight of being. Usually these three are considered as fused into one, that is, as a fully conscious and delightful infinite existence. But they can also be experienced in such a way that one or another stands out in front and the others stand in the background of the experience. These underlie all things. They are the fundamental reality of things as far as we can conceive of it. Next, Sri Aurobindo says that Satchidananda, this infinite self-existence, reveals itself to us in three ways, which reflect its essential nature: as the self of all, as conscious being or spirit, and as God, or the divine being. He then translates these into Sanskrit terms. The pure self of all that is the Atman. The conscious being or spirit of each thing in existence is Purusha. And God, or divine being, is Ishvara. Clarifying these three in a sentence that comes a little later on, he says, it is the absolute, independent of all relatives. Here he is referring to Atman, the absolute basing all relatives. Here he is referring to Purusha, the absolute governing, pervading, constituting all relatives. And here he is referring to Ishvara. I should also note that a little later in the passage he will describe that each of these three have a dynamic aspect, thus forming three pairs. Atman Maya, where Maya is the self-force of Atman. That is, he says, conceptively creative of all things. The second pair, Purusha Prakriti, where Prakriti is nature or force made dynamically executive, working out all things under the witnessing eye of the conscious being. And Ishvara Shakti, where Shakti is both conceptively creative and dynamically executive of all the divine workings. Now let us continue with the passage where he describes the reality in terms of these various principles. And here he uses this more plastic, intuitive, revealingly poetic language that he mentioned earlier. The Upanishads affirm that all this is the Brahman. Mind is Brahman, life is Brahman, Matter is Brahman. Addressing Vayu, the Lord of air, of life, it is said, O Vayu, thou art manifest Brahman. And pointing to man and beast and bird and insect, each separately is identified with the one. O Brahman, thou art this old man and boy and girl, this bird, this insect. Brahman is the consciousness that knows itself in all that exists. Brahman is the force that sustains the power of God and Titan and demon, the force that acts in man and animal and the forms and energies of nature. Brahman is the Ananda, the secret bliss of existence, which is the ether of our being, and without which none could breathe or live. Brahman is the inner soul of all. It has taken a form in correspondence with each creative form which it inhabits. The Lord of beings is that which is conscious in the conscious being, but he is also the conscious in inconscient things, the one who is master and in control of the many that are passive in the hands of force nature. He is the timeless and time. He is space and all that is in space. He is causality and the cause and the effect. He is the thinker and his thought, the warrior and his courage, the gambler and his dice throw. All realities and all aspects and all semblances are the Brahman. Brahman is the absolute, the transcendent and incommunicable, the supracosmic existence that sustains the cosmos, the cosmic self that upholds all beings. But it is too the self of each individual. The soul or psychic entity is an eternal portion of the Ishvara. It is his supreme nature or consciousness force that has become the living being in a world of living beings. The Brahman alone is, and because of it, all are. For all are the Brahman. This reality is the reality of everything that we see in self and nature. Brahman, the Ishvara, is all this by his Yoga Maya, by the power of his consciousness force put out in self-manifestation. He is the conscious being, soul, spirit, Purusha, and it is by his nature, the force of his conscious self-existence, that he is all things. He is the Ishvara, the omniscient and omnipotent all-ruler, and it is by his Shakti, his conscious power, that he manifests himself in time and governs the universe. These and similar statements taken together are all comprehensive. It is possible for the mind to cut and select, to build a closed system and explain away all that does not fit within it. But it is on the complete and many-sided statement that we must take our stand if we are to acquire an integral knowledge. I need not parse this statement, but simply highlight the statement that Brahman is the absolute, the transcendent and incommunicable, the supracosmic existence that sustains the cosmos, the cosmic self that upholds all beings, but it is to the self of each individual. The soul or psychic entity is an eternal portion of the Ishvara. At the same time, we should highlight that Brahman is not only the self or soul or spirit of things, but he also is all things, the living being in a world of living beings. Another quote from Letters on Yoga 1 gives a similar comprehensive view of the Brahman, here referred to as the divine, but it also relates it more directly to our experience of it. He says, "The divine has three aspects for us. One, it is the cosmic self and spirit that is in and behind all things and beings, from which and in which all is manifested in the universe, although it is now a manifestation in the ignorance. Two, it is the spirit and master of our being within us, whom we have to serve and learn to express his will in all our movements, so that we may grow out of the ignorance into the light. Three, the divine is transcendent being and spirit, all bliss and light and divine knowledge and power. And towards that highest divine existence and its light, we have to rise and bring down the reality of it more and more into our consciousness and life. In the ordinary nature, we live in the ignorance and do not know the divine. The forces of the ordinary nature are undivine forces because they weave a veil of ego and desire and unconsciousness, which conceals the divine from us. To get into the higher and deeper consciousness, which knows and lives consciously in the divine, we have to get rid of the forces of the lower nature and open to the action of the divine Shakti, which will transform our consciousness into that of the divine nature. This is the conception of the divine from which we have to start. The realization of its truth can only come with the opening of the consciousness and its change. That's from Letters on Yoga 1, pages 7 and 8. Finally, one last quote from the Synthesis of Yoga relates the Brahman to our human experience and brings out even more forcefully its implications for yoga and for life. He says, "Our whole being, soul, mind, sense, heart, will, life, body, must consecrate all its energies so entirely and in such a way that it shall become a fit vehicle for the divine. This is no easy task, for everything in the world follows the fixed habit which is to it a law and resists a radical change. And no change can be more radical than the revolution attempted in the integral yoga. Everything in us has constantly to be called back to the central faith and will and vision Every thought and impulse has to be reminded in the language of the Upanishad that that is the divine Brahman and not this which men here adore. Every vital fiber has to be persuaded to accept an entire renunciation of all that hitherto represented to it its own existence. Mind has to cease to be mind and become brilliant with something beyond it. Life has to change into a thing vast and calm and intense and powerful that can no longer recognize its old, blind, eager, narrow self of petty impulse and desire. Even the body has to submit to a mutation and be no longer the clamorous animal or the impeding clod it now is, but become instead a conscious servant and radiant instrument and living form of the Spirit. That's from pages 72 and 73 of the Synthesis. While the Brahman is everything and everywhere, we live in its domains of ignorance, in a state in which we are effectively separated from it in our own limited and egoistic existence, consciousness, and pleasure and pain. In order to live in the consciousness of Brahman and partake of its infinite existence and unmixed delight of being, we must break down the barriers of our egoistic consciousness that separate us from its greater being. The Brahman allows us the freedom to remain in our limited existence if we choose. But if we choose to break out of it into its infinity, it will help us with its force, the force of the mother. However, this help will come only to the extent that we truly open and surrender ourselves to it and the greater being of the divine, and not cling to our own limitations. This requires an integral and intense aspiration and endeavor, a sincere and effective practice of the integral yoga. Now, let us explore how the Brahman is expressed in Savitri. In the future poetry, Sri Aurobindo says, the rhythmic word has a subtly sensible element, its sound value, a quite immaterial element, its significance or thought value. And both of these again, its sound and its sense, have separately and together a soul value, a direct spiritual power, which is infinitely the most important thing about them. Thus, poetry tends to have a greater power than prose to transmit this direct spiritual power. The truths of the Brahman, which the poet accesses, are communicated more directly to the soul, the divine element of the Brahman, which exists within the listener and helps to awaken that and bring it out into the outer consciousness. The main point of this is that we should attune ourselves to the sound of the poetry and not focus exclusively on its thought. Also, we should open ourselves to its soul value, its spiritual power, allowing it to touch and move our own soul. The first passage I'll read is fairly short, so I'll read it all the way through once and then read it a second time in parts, commenting on each part. This passage comes from Book 1, Canto 4, which is titled The Secret Knowledge, and starts on page 67. The Absolute, the Perfect, the Alone, has called out of the silence his mute force, where she lay in the featureless and formless hush, guarding from time by her immobile sleep the ineffable puissance of his solitude. The Absolute, the Perfect, the Alone, has entered with his silence into space. He has fashioned these countless persons of oneself. He has built 1,000,000 figures of his power. He lives in all who lived in his vast alone. Space is himself, and time is only he. The Absolute, the Perfect, the Immune, one who is in us as our secret self, our mask of imperfection has assumed. He has made this tenement of flesh his own, his image in the human measure cast, that to his divine measure we might rise. Then in a figure of divinity, the Maker shall recast us and impose a plan of Godhead on the mortal's mold, lifting our finite minds to his infinite, touching the moment with eternity. This transfiguration is earth due to heaven. A mutual debt binds man to the supreme. His nature we must put on as he put ours. We are sons of God and must be even as he. His human portion, we must grow divine. Our life is a paradox with God for key. So again, I'll just read the first part of the passage. The Absolute, the Perfect, the Alone, has called out of the silence his mute force, where she lay in the featureless and formless hush, guarding from time by her immobile sleep the ineffable puissance of his solitude. Here, Sri Aurobindo describes the transcendent, where Atman exists in the silence, and his force is mute, silent, lying in the featureless and formless hush, in an immobile sleep. The next part. The Absolute, the Perfect, the Alone, has entered with his silence into space. He has fashioned these countless persons of oneself. He has built 1,000,000 figures of his power. He lives in all who lived in his vast alone. Space is himself, and time is only he. Here, Sri Aurobindo describes the cosmic spirit entering with his silence into time and space, fashioning these countless persons of oneself, a million figures of his power. He lives in each and in all as the Purusha, with Prakriti as his outer nature. The next part, the absolute, the perfect, the immune, one who is in us as our secret self. Our mask of imperfection has assumed. He has made this tenement of flesh his own, his image in the human measure cast, that to his divine measure we might rise. Then, in a figure of divinity, the Maker shall recast us and impose a plan of Godhead on the mortal's mold, lifting our finite minds to his infinite, touching the moment with eternity. Here, Sri Aurobindo describes the Ishvara Shakti entering into and taking control over each individual person in the manifestation. The Ishvara lives in us as our secret soul. He has made this tenement of flesh his own. A tenement is a residence, usually a rental house or apartment block. He has done this for a purpose. He has cast his image into our human measure so that we might rise to his divine measure. And then he will recast us into a new godlike mold. And the last part, this transfiguration is earth's due to heaven. A mutual debt binds man to the Supreme. His nature we must put on as he put ours. We are sons of God and must be even as he. His human portion, we must grow divine. Our life is a paradox with God for key. Here, Sri Aurobindo lays out our relation with the divine. We are sons of God and must be even as he. He has put on our nature and we must put on his. We are his human portion and we must grow divine. I'd like to emphasize the imperatives that Sri Aurobindo uses here. Earth's due to heaven, mutual debt, and the repetition of must. This is the paradox of our existence. Its challenge, its opportunity, its destiny. The next passage is longer and more elaborately and comprehensively describes the Brahman. I will again break it into several sections and comment briefly on each. This is from Book 10, Canto 4, The Dream Twilight of the Earthly Real, on pages 656 to 658, starting near the middle of the page. All contraries are aspects of God's face. The many are the innumerable one. The one carries the multitude in his breast. He is the impersonal, inscrutable soul. He is the one infinite person seeing his world. The silence bears the eternal's great dumb seal. His light inspires the eternal word. He is the immobile's deep and deathless hush. Its white and signless blank negating calm. Yet stands the Creator Self, the Almighty Lord, and watches his will done by the forms of gods and the desire that goads half-conscious man and the reluctant and unseeing night. Here, Sri Aurobindo reconciles different aspects of the one Brahman, the one and the many, the impersonal and the personal, the silence and the word, the white and signless blank negating calm, and the Creator Self, the Almighty Lord, who watches over his creation, which stretches from the gods to the reluctant and unseeing night as they fulfill his will. Continues. These wide divine extremes, these inverse powers, are the right and left side of the body of God. Existence balanced twixt two mighty arms confronts the mind with unsolved abysms of thought. Darkness below, a fathomless light above. In light are joined, but sundered by severing mind, stand face to face, opposite, inseparable. Two contraries needed for his great world task. Two poles whose currents wake the immense world force. In the stupendous secrecy of his self, above the world, brooding with equal wings. He is both in one, beginningless, without end. Transcending both, he enters the absolute. Here, Sri Aurobindo shows us two opposite sides of the Brahman, one a fathomless light above, the other the darkness below. He says they are joined in the light above, but are separated by the mind, and so appear to us opposite. Both are needed for the great world task, the manifestation of the divine in an infinity of forms. Above, where they are united, the divine self broods over the world, and transcending this self, he enters the absolute. His being is a mystery beyond mind. His ways bewilder mortal ignorance. The finite in its little sections parked, amazed, credits not God's audacity, who dares to be the unimagined all and see and act as might one infinite. against human reason. This is his offense. Being known to be forever unknowable, to be all, and yet transcend the mystic whole. Absolute, to lodge in a relative world of time. Eternal and all-knowing, to suffer birth. Omnipotent, to sport with chance and fate. Spirit, yet to be matter and the void. Illimitable, beyond form or name, to dwell within a body, one and supreme, to be animal and human and divine. A still, deep sea, he laughs in rolling waves. Universal, he is all. Transcendent, none. Here, Sri Aurobindo explains that the ultimate unity of these dualities of the divine baffles the mind. As he puts it in the first line of the passage, all contraries are aspects of God's face. He explains that the expression of the one divine in its various dual aspects bewilders us. To be simultaneously what is known and yet unknowable, all and yet transcendent of all, absolute and eternal, and yet suffer birth in time, spirit and yet matter, beyond form or name and yet dwell in a body, universal and all, and yet be transcendent and none. He brings the mystery closer to our experience and understanding with the line, a still deep sea, he laughs in rolling waves. To man's righteousness, this is his cosmic crime. Almighty, beyond good and evil, to dwell, leaving the good to their fate in a wicked world, and evil to reign in this enormous scene. All opposition seems, and strife, and chance, and aimless labor with but scanty sense, to eyes that see a part and miss the whole. The surface men scan, the depths refuse their search. A high-bred mystery challenges the view, or a sordid or a discouraging, sordid miracle. Yet in the exact, inconscient, stark conceit, in the casual error of the world's ignorance, a plan, a hidden intelligence is glimpsed. There is a purpose in each stumble and fall. Nature's most careless lolling is a pose, preparing some forward step, some deep result. Ingenious notes plugged into a motive score. These million discords dot the harmonious theme of the evolution's huge orchestral dance. Here, Sri Aurobindo shows how the mystery of the divine's unity of dualities also baffles our human sense of morality and goodness. He says the divine is beyond good and evil, and it appears to leave the good to their fate in a wicked world, and allows evil to reign. But he explains that it appears this way to us because we see only parts and not the whole. That there is a plan and purpose in the world's design, that these million discords are incidental dots or ingenious notes in the harmonious theme of the evolution's huge orchestral dance. A truth supreme has forced the world to be. It has wrapped itself in matter as in a shroud of death, a shroud of ignorance. It compelled the suns to burn through silent space, flame signs of its uncomprehended thought, in a wide, brooding ether's formless muse. It made of knowledge a veiled and struggling light, of being a substance nescient, dense and dumb, of bliss the beauty of an insentient world. In finite things the conscious infinite dwells. Involved it sleeps in matter's helpless trance. It rules the world from its sleeping, senseless void. Dreaming, it throws out mind and heart and soul to labor crippled, bound on the hard earth. A broken whole, it works through scattered points. Its gleaming shards are wisdom's diamond thoughts. Its shadowy reflex, our ignorance. This is from pages 656 to 658. In the final section of this passage, Sri Aurobindo describes how the divine dwells within the world, within its matter and ignorant life, forcing it to be, ruling it from within its helpless trance, compelling it to labor on the hard earth, throwing out from its dreams, mind and heart and soul, working through individual scattered points, the gleaming broken shards of its wisdom. In the next passage, we get the description of a subjective experience of the Brahman. It is Savitri's experience at the culmination of her yoga, just prior to Satyavan's death. She has already discovered her soul, had the realization of nirvana, and here she has the experience of the cosmic spirit and the cosmic consciousness. The passage comes from Book 7, Canto 7, the cosmic spirit and the cosmic consciousness, and starts on page 555. It was herself. It was the self of all. It was the reality of existing things. It was the consciousness of all that lived and felt and saw. It was timelessness and time. It was the bliss of formlessness and form. It was all love and the one beloved's arms. It was sight and thought in one all-seeing mind. It was joy of being on the peaks of God. She passed beyond time into eternity, slipped out of space, and became the infinite. Her being rose into unreachable heights and found no end of its journey in the self. It plunged into the unfathomable deeps and found no end to the silent mystery that held all world within one lonely breast, yet harbored all creation's multitudes. She was all vastness and one measureless point. She was a height beyond heights, a depth beyond depths. She lived in the everlasting and was all that harbors death and bears the wheeling hours. All contraries were true in one huge spirit, surpassing measure, change, and circumstance. An individual, one with cosmic self, in the heart of the transcendence miracle, and the secret of world personality was the Creator and the Lord of all. Mind was a single innumerable look upon himself and all that he became. Life was his drama and the vast a stage. The universe was his body, God its soul. All was one single immense reality, all its innumerable phenomenon. Sri Aurobindo describes this experience of Savitri as the unification of the individual with the cosmic self in the heart of the transcendence miracle. She identifies with a world personality that was the Creator and Lord of all. He says, all was one single immense reality, all its innumerable phenomenon. In the final passage I will quote from Savitri, we get a clear sense of the meaning of the world and the presence of the divine in its difficult and struggling evolution. It comes in the debate between Savitri and death, in which Savitri explains that the divine is present in the world and in matter, and that despite all contrary appearances, there is a purpose behind its difficulties and that it is moving towards perfection. The passage comes from Book 10, Canto 3, The Debate of Love and Death, and starts on page 623. In God concealed the world began to be. Tardily, it travels towards manifest God. Our imperfection towards perfection toils. The body is the chrysalis of a soul. The infinite holds the finite in its arms. Time travels towards revealed eternity. A miracle structure of the eternal mage, matter its mystery hides from its own eyes. A scripture written out in cryptic signs, an occult document of the all-wonderful's art. All here bears witness to his secret might. In all we feel his presence and his power. A blaze of his sovereign glory is the sun. A glory is the gold and glimmering moon. A glory is his dream of purple sky. A march of his greatness are the wheeling stars. His laughter of beauty breaks out in green trees. His moments of beauty triumph in a flower. The blue seas chant, the rivulet's wandering voice are murmurs falling from the eternal's harp. This world is God fulfilled in outwardness. His ways challenge our reason and our sense. By blind, brute movements of an ignorant force, by means we slight as small, obscure, or base, a greatness founded upon little things. He has built a world in the unknowing void. His forms he has massed from infinitesimal dust. His marvels are built from insignificant things. If mind is crippled, life untaught and crude, if brutal masks are there and evil acts, they are incidents of his vast and varied plot. His great and dangerous dramas needed steps. He makes with these and all his passion play, a play and yet no play, but the deep scheme of a transcendent wisdom, finding ways to meet her Lord in the shadow and the night. Above her is the vigil of the stars, watched by a solitary infinitude. She embodies in dumb matter the divine, in symbol minds and lives the absolute. The passage is revealing in its illustration of the presence of the divine in the world through its depiction of the beauty evident in nature. At the same time, it does not deny the presence of brutality and evil in the world, but explains that they were needed steps in an evolution in which the divine, hidden within dumb matter, is blossoming into revealed eternity. It explains that their purpose is to embody in inconscient matter the divine, in symbol minds and lives the absolute. It also suggests that the whole process is being looked after and guided by the divine. For example, in the line, "The infinite holds the finite in its arms." We have considered the indescribable Brahman as it is described by Sri Aurobindo in both his prose and his poetry. As Sri Aurobindo noted in the beginning of this talk, that although the Brahman is unknowable to our minds, we can know it through identification with it, because it is the essential reality of who we are. Inspired language can help us in this endeavor to identify with our essential reality. I would like to conclude with a passage from the Future Poetry in which Sri Aurobindo discusses the difference between prose and poetry. He says, "Reason and taste, two powers of the intelligence, are rightly the supreme gods of the prose stylist, while to the poet they are only minor deities. If it, that is prose, goes beyond these limits, approaches in its measures a more striking rhythmic balance, uses images for sheer vision, opens itself to a mightier breadth of speech, prose style passes beyond its normal province and approaches or even enters the confines of poetry. It becomes poetical prose, or even poetry itself, using the apparent forms of prose as a disguise or a loose apparel. A high or a fine adequacy, effectivity, intellectual illuminativeness, and a carefully tempered aesthetic satisfaction are the natural and proper powers of its speech. But the privilege of the poet is to go beyond and discover that more intense illumination of speech, that inspired word and supreme inevitable utterance, in which there meets the unity of a divine rhythmic movement with a depth of sense and a power of infinite suggestion, welling up directly from the fountain heads of the Spirit within us. He may not always or often find it, but to seek for it is the law, or at least the highest trend of his utterance. And when he can not only find it, but cast it into some deeply revealed truth of the Spirit itself, he utters the mantra. That's from pages 16 and 17 of the Future Poetry. I think this well describes the poetical prose, or even the poetry of the life divine, as well as the mantric quality of Savitri, particularly in the passages I have read here today. Thank you.